Suffering. Today we will suffer, which I guess that's not really new on the channel. But today I have for you the story of the biblical book of Job. And as usual, I have lots of visual scenes prepared for you, so stay tuned for that and subscribe. No, like, actually do it. And now, just so you know, this book is part of wisdom literature, which is a genre that basically teaches about divinity and virtue through the words of sages and the wise. And of course, the wisdom that we find in the book of Job is all about suffering and God's justice. Is it true that only the wicked suffer, or does suffering have some sort of higher purpose? And most importantly, what about the righteous people who did everything right and yet they still suffer? And well, we're going to find a lot of different answers to those questions, so really pay attention to who says what, because not every answer is correct. And actually, some of the answers are exactly what you shouldn't think about God's justice. That is, of course, if you're a Christian, because if you're not, then, like, you do you, I guess. But even if you're not Christian, I still think that the story can be pretty interesting to you, because even if God doesn't exist in your worldview, suffering certainly does. And you can still deeply reflect on the nature and purpose of suffering by getting to know the story of the book of Job. Also, like, please don't pay attention to my hair, because it looks so bad. I don't know, if you're new on the channel, or maybe you just don't know or something, I'm growing out my blonde hair, and so it looks terrible, and it's going to look even worse, which is just fantastic. But yeah, I guess this is just how it is, and that's how it's going to be for the next couple of months. And so we finally begin the story, and we find ourselves in the land of Uz, and here we see Job and his wife. Now, Job is described here as a man who's blameless, upright, who fears God, and who always turns away from evil. And not only that, but he's said to be the greatest of all the people of the East, as he has 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. And now when it comes to his children, they are all very fond of feasts, and they basically have this habit where the 7 sons take turns hosting the feasts. And then at the end of the cycle, Job sends for them, sanctifies them, and then rises early in the morning in order to offer burnt offerings, one for each of his children. And he does that because he always fears that maybe his children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts, and so he just wants to be extra safe here. Now, after this introduction, we go to heaven, and we see here, yeah, let's actually stop for a moment, because what we see is debatable. So first of all, before I even speak, am I an expert on that? No, I am just deeply interested in this stuff. So I hope that I provide some sort of valuable information, but at the same time, if you find it interesting as well, then find some experts and go to them. That's basically, yeah, that's basically this channel, actually, I think. So yeah, having said that, let me have fun now. So the original Hebrew version uses words that translate to the sons of God, and then that's like further translated, interpreted, as for example, the angels in NIV, and then the heavenly beings in NRSV. I'm going to give you screens somewhere here. And you may be like, okay, what's even the point? Well, the point is that those are different words, and I think that it's different. Isn't that interesting? That, I don't know, I find it to be so interesting that we have different words like this, because I guess it just gives you like a different way of seeing the Bible or something like that. And so for the purpose of this video, because I guess I'm also telling you about this because, you know, I have to establish the characters somehow, because I have to do the scenes and everything. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to use the heavenly beings, and the reason for that is my personal preference, because I think that it sounds so nice. And so we are in heaven, and we see here the heavenly beings show up in order to present themselves before the Lord. And among them, we also see Satan, but not really. And listen, because this one is even more interesting than the previous one. And that's because in Hebrew, the word Satan basically means the accuser, but it's not even like, because when you hear this, you may be like, oh, so it means that we have this creature whose name is Satan, and the name Satan means the accuser. Just like my name is Victoria and it means victory. But no, that's not. It's different here, because basically I'm going to show you a screen somewhere here. the word Satan that's in the Bible here has this prefix ha, so it's ha Satan, and basically, as far as I know, because like again, I'm not an expert on any of this, but as far as I read about this, it turns out that basically in Hebrew, because also like this prefix ha just basically means the, so it's the Satan, the accuser. And as far as I know, in Hebrew, you never actually place this prefix before a name. And so that basically means that Satan in the book of Job is actually a nameless creature whose title is the accuser or the adversary, because sometimes you also translate it as the adversary. But he doesn't actually have a name. And you can also see it. I'm going to show you the screens once again. In NIV, you actually have Satan, like capital letter, as if it's his name, but like I don't know, I feel like this is a wrong translation, like it has to be the wrong translation. I don't know what possibly I could miss here. Maybe I am missing something, because like I literally don't know, but I don't really see what is there to miss. And on the other hand, you have the NRSV translation, and here you actually have the accuser instead of Satan. So that's like correct, I guess? I don't know. But it's kind of weird. Like, why do we have such a wrong translation here? I don't know the reason for that. So yeah, I guess this is an interesting fact for you. I don't know, maybe I am missing something. So like, again, as I'm saying, you know, if you're interested in what I'm talking about, go to people who are actually knowledgeable on this stuff, because I am not an expert. I'm just interested. Maybe I'm just missing something. And so now, after my yapping session, we go back to heaven and we see the Lord, the heavenly beings, and the accuser. And the Lord begins here by asking, where is the accuser coming from? And the accuser replies that he's been wandering around the earth. To this, the Lord is like, well, have you seen my servant Job? He's the finest man on earth, blameless, upright, he fears God and always turns away from evil. And the accuser replies by saying, well, no wonder really. You have put a protective fence around him and you have blessed the work of his hands. But if you only stretch out your hand and take everything he has, he will definitely curse you without a second thought. And to this the Lord is like, okay, so from this point on, everything that Job has is in your hands and you can do whatever you want with it, just don't hurt him directly. And then after that, the accuser leaves. Following that, we go back to Job and we see here a messenger coming up to him with some pretty bad news. He says that while Job's oxen were plowing and his donkeys were feeding nearby, suddenly some people showed up and they carried the animals off, and they also took the lives of Job's servants, leaving the messenger as the only one who managed to escape. And while he's still speaking, suddenly another messenger shows up and he says that the fire of God fell from heaven and consumed both Job's sheep and servants. And then another messenger shows up and this one says that some other people raided Job's lands and they carried away his camels, and before he's even able to finish, the last messenger comes in. And this one says that while Job's children were eating and drinking in their oldest brother's house, suddenly a great wind appeared. It struck the four corners of the house that then fell on Job's children, and unfortunately the messenger is the only one who managed to escape alive. And I think that this point is actually kind of interesting. I don't know if it was intentional, but in the beginning we learned that Job's children had this habit of drinking and eating, and basically the 7 sons were taking turns hosting those parties, those feasts. And so I kind of feel like, I don't remember if it was said like this exactly, but I kind of feel like they were probably starting from the oldest one and then going to the youngest one, because that's kind of makes sense in my head that it would work like this. And remember also that like at the end of a cycle of those feasts, Job was always calling for his children to come to him, and he always sanctified them and then offered some burnt offerings because he was afraid that maybe they sinned sinned in some sort of way and they cursed God in their heart. And so I feel like it kind of adds to their innocence that they were currently partying in their older brother's house, so that they just started the cycle, and so they were kind of like sinless in that moment or something like that. I think that it's a nice thing to think about. That's my assumption, so I don't know if that's correct. I think that the implication is kind of there. I don't know. Now, after learning all of this, Job gets up and he tears his robe, and he does that because this was actually a custom back in the day to tear your robe as a sign of mourning, as it indicated a broken heart. And then Job shaves his head, he throws himself down with his face to the ground, and then he says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And so Job, of course, does not sin here, and he stays as blameless as before. Following that, we find ourselves back in heaven, and we see here the council assembling again with the heavenly beings, the Lord, and the accuser. And the Lord actually starts here with the same question as before, which is, where does the accuser come from? And the accuser replies, saying that he's been wandering the earth. And so the Lord then starts talking about Job, and he says that, well, he's still the same upright, blameless man who fears God and who turns away from evil, even though the accuser has provoked him to destroy Job without reason. To this, the accuser replies, saying that, well, a man will of course give up everything he has in order to save his life, but if the Lord stretches out his hand and hurts Job physically, then he will definitely curse him. And so to this, the Lord is of course like, okay, so from this point on, Job is completely in your hands, just make sure that he stays alive. The accuser then leaves, and we are informed that soon after he afflicted Job with a horrible disease. But instead of cursing God, Job just took a shard of broken pottery to scrap himself with, and he sat among the ashes. And then after he does that, his wife suddenly comes up to him and she asks him whether he's still maintaining his integrity, and then she tells him to curse God and die. But to this, Job just says that she talks like a foolish woman, though the meaning of that word is actually closer to someone not being moral instead of being silly. And then Job asks, should we receive good from God and not evil? And so of course he remains sinless here. And now after all of this, Job is actually visited by 3 of his friends, each from a different country, and their names are Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathai, or something like that. I hope that it's at least semi-correct. And well, it turns out that Job is actually so changed here that they don't even recognize him from a distance, but then once they get closer, they get so hurt by the sight of him that they weep, tear their robes, and then throw dust over their heads. After that, Job's friends sit down with him on the ground, and they stay like this for 7 days and 7 nights without saying a single word, because they see how great his pain is. Then after that time, Job finally speaks, and he begins by cursing the day he was born, as he says, "Let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said, a male is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, or light shine on it." And he laments like this for quite some time, asking why didn't he die at birth, and why wasn't he buried as a stillborn infant, as at least he would be at peace now. And then he ends his lament by saying, "What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil." Now to this, Eliphaz replies, and in general, you know, it's said that his friends came here to support him, but they're basically going to do everything but that. And so Eliphaz starts here by saying that, well, you are always instructing others, helping them, and supporting those who stumbled, and yet now that you are the one who's suffering, you are impatient and terrified. Isn't your fear of God your confidence, and your blamelessness your hope? Besides, think about this. Who, being innocent, ever perished? And were the upright ever destroyed? Well, no, only those who saw trouble reap the same, and then they perish by the breath of God and are consumed by his anger. And now, after saying all of this, Eliphaz continues, and he reveals that that once he actually received some secret knowledge. And so he tells a story about how once he was having a nightmare when suddenly a spirit passed by his face and it terrified him quite a bit. And so he then opened his eyes and noticed some sort of form in front of him, but he couldn't really recognize its appearance. And then he heard a voice telling him basically that there's no man who could be pure and righteous before God, and then it explained it further by saying, even in his servants he, God, puts no trust, and his angels he charges with error. How much more those who live in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed like a moth. And so he's kind of saying all of this to point Job to the idea that every human is a sinner, and that's because Job was kind of saying that he's blameless and so he doesn't deserve his fate. But of course his friends believe that, well, that's kind of impossible because like why would God punish him if he was blameless? And so now Eliphaz continues and he's basically like, you know what? I've seen a fool who was suddenly cursed and his children are far from safety. Which is, yeah, he's kind of describing Job here. It's not that nice. And then Eliphaz also tells him that evil does not come up from the dust, but people are born to trouble. And then he adds that if he were in Job's situation, then he would just seek God and commit his cause to him. And that's because God does unimaginable things. He gives rain on the earth, sends water to the fields, sets the lowly on high, and lifts those who mourn to safety. But at the same time, God saves the needy from the sword of their mouth and the poor from the hand of the powerful. And so, as we can see, according to Eliphaz, God is very powerful and just, and so Job shouldn't really worry that much and he should actually be happy. And Eliphaz then explains exactly why that is, as he says, how happy is the one whom God reproves. Therefore, do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he binds up. He strikes, but his hands heal. And so basically, when it comes to this part of the story, Eliphaz's interpretation of the events is that Job has sinned, which is normal because every human is a sinner, and God is now reproving him for that. And Job should actually be grateful for that, and he should just confess his sin so that God can deliver him from the suffering he has found himself in. And what's also worth pointing out here is that at the end of his speech, Eliphaz says, "See, we have searched this out, it is true. Hear and know it for yourself." And so the problem with that is that, of course, it kind of reads as, you know, oh, it makes sense in my head, therefore it's true. So yeah, that's amazing. I mean, like, I sometimes draw conclusions like that. You can hear me so many times on the channel saying, like, you know, I don't know if it's true, but it makes sense in my head. But, like, you know, because something makes sense in my head, I'm going to believe it for myself, but I'm not going to believe that it's true. You know what I mean? So now to all of this, Job replies by lamenting that his grief is heavier than the sand of the sea, and that's the only reason he's being so harsh in the beginning. And he also says here, "For the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me." Then Job continues asking whether a donkey complains when it's near grass, implying that it's natural to lament when you have something to lament about. And so he then goes back to lamenting, saying that he really wishes that God would grant his desire and end his life, as he really doesn't see the point of waiting and being patient. And if God ends his life now, then despite his suffering, Job will be able to rejoice that he has never concealed the words of the Holy One. After that, Job complains about his friends for a while, saying that they withhold kindness from him, probably just because they are afraid of his suffering, seeing it as some sort of godly punishment. And then he adds that he did not ask them for any kind of gift or bribe or to deliver him from the enemy. No, and actually he'll be silent if they only explain to him what he did wrong to deserve his suffering. But the thing is that they don't want to do it. They don't want to actually understand his problem. They just want to rebuke him, seeing him as someone who deserves to be punished. Now, after he says all of this, he tells his friends to look him in the eyes as he won't lie to them, and then he asks, "Is there any wrong on my tongue? cannot my taste this current calamity? Then Job goes back to lamenting about how bad the life of a human is, and he compares it both to a military service and the life of a slave. And then as he keeps lamenting, he says that his life is but a breath. It moves fast and it's meaningless, and his eyes will never again see good. And so because his life is so incredibly miserable, he allows himself to complain in the bitterness of his soul, and he now directs his words straight to God. At first, Job asks whether he's some sort of a dragon that God had to put under guard, and then he complains that he despises his life and asks God to just leave him alone, as currently he feels like he's being constantly watched. And then he eventually ends his lament by asking, "If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of humanity? Why have you made me your target? Why have I become a burden to you?" Eventually, one of his other friends, Bildad, speaks out and he's like, "Okay, man, how long will you keep saying things like this? Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert what's right? Yeah, I don't really think so." And so then Bildad continues, saying that if Job's children were punished in such a way, then surely they must have sinned against God, because what other explanation could there be? And he also adds that Job should really seek God and ask for his grace, because if Job really is pure and upright, then God will surely restore him and maybe even give him more than he already had. Some wisdom from the unwise. After that, Bildad tells Job to pay close attention to the ways of their ancestors, because after all, they are both too young to have any real knowledge about the world. And then, as Bildad is getting close to the end of his speech, he starts to talk about the rule of cause and effect, and he basically says here that all who forget God will eventually wither away and their hope will perish. And then at the very end, Bildad tries to comfort Job a little bit, as he says, "See, God will not reject the blameless, nor take the hand of evildoers. He will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy." But of course, he still says it in this sort of Job, we all know that you're a nasty sinner, so you just have to repent and then you will be happy. And the problem is that we of course know that Job doesn't deserve his punishment. Still, Job replies, and at first he actually agrees with Bildad here, but then he asks, how can a human be just before God? Especially considering that God is extremely powerful, which actually frightens Job, as he's not even sure how he would be able to speak with God. And so even though he still believes himself to be innocent, he fears that God would not even listen to him, and then he also adds, "Though I'm innocent, my own mouth would condemn me. Though I'm blameless, he would prove me perverse." And so Job wishes here for some kind of mediator so that he could speak with God without fear. And of course, this passage can be seen as a prophecy of Jesus. Now, after saying all of this, Job begins to lament once again, saying that if he could speak with God right now, he would just ask him why he contends against him. And he would also ask him about his nature, so whether he sees as humans see, or whether he perceives time as humans do, and stuff like this. But here, as Job keeps lamenting, he gets himself back into this incredibly low place as he compares God to a lion who hunts him, then asks why did God even allow him to be born, and he even adds, "Are not the days of my life few? Let me alone that I may find a little comfort before I go, never to return, to the land of gloom and deep darkness, to the land of gloom and chaos, where light is like darkness." Following that, we get to Job's third friend, Zophar, and yeah, this one is the most nasty of them all. And so Zophar begins by saying that Job talks so incredibly much, but at the same time, his idle words don't really prove anything. And well, Job says here that he's clean in God's sight, but if God were to speak, he would reveal the secret knowledge so that Job would understand that God has actually forgiven some of his sin. Which, that's kind of it's almost like he was not even listening to him then, because Job never said that he's perfectly clean and that he was always perfectly clean. He was just making a point that, right now he didn't do anything wrong to deserve his suffering. And we know that he's right about that. But still, Zophar continues, reminding Job how great and powerful God is, and what's the most important here is that God is just, he sees evil and he doesn't ignore it. And so, according to Zophar, Job needs to direct his heart rightly, stretch out his hand towards God, and let go of his wickedness. Then he will once again be secure and he will forget all of his misery. And then at the end of his speech, Zophar kind of scares Job as he says to him, "But the eyes of the wicked will fail. All way of escape will be lost to them, and their hope is to breathe their last." Now, to all of this, Job answers saying that, well, there's no doubt that you are the people, but I have understanding as well as you do. I am not inferior to you, and besides, who doesn't know the things that you've been talking about? And after that, Job complains that he, a righteous and blameless man, is just a laughingstock to his friends, as everything they've said is known even by the animals, the earth, and the sea. And so Job then talks a bit about God, saying that he's of course great and powerful, and he essentially makes like a big speech here about the power of God, just to make his friends realize that he really knows the ways of God. And so everything they said was kind of useless because they only said what's obvious. And so Job then adds, "Look, my eye has seen all this. My ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you." And after saying this, he adds that he really wishes he could speak to the Almighty and argue his case with God himself, as his friends are just some worthless physicians. And he also tells them, if you would only keep silent, that would be your wisdom. After that, Job tells his friends that they should be really careful about what they're saying, because what if in their attempt to speak for God, they are just telling lies? And so he warns them that God will surely rebuke them if they treat their needy friend in a way that they wouldn't want to be treated. And then he also adds, your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. After that, Job once again says that he really needs to speak with God about this whole situation, and so he actually speaks to him now. And he starts by saying that he only has two wishes for God. The first one is for God to withdraw his hand far away from him, and the second one is for God to stop frightening him with his terrors. And then Job asks God how many sins he has, and why does it seem that God hides his face from him and counts him as his enemy. And he also fears that God is making him pay for the sins of his youth, which is interesting because you can clearly see here that it's not like Job thinks that he's this sinless being just because. Like, no, he actually recognizes the times when he was not that good of a person, and he also recognizes that right now he really doesn't deserve the suffering he's going through. And so Job then talks a bit about how miserable the life of a human is, and he asks God to just look away from him until he fulfills his time like a hired laborer. And after that, we get to a pretty interesting part where Job begins to wonder what happens after we die, and he fears that there might be nothing after death. Because he says here that, well, there's of course hope for a tree, because even when it's cut down, it will sprout again, but where does a man go after he dies? And to Job, it seems that humans are actually more similar to a river that just simply dries up. But still, he hopes that there is some sort of life after death, and he promises that if only God calls him, he will answer and serve him. To all of this, Eliphaz now speaks, and he's really not happy with what Job said, and so he accuses him of limiting wisdom to himself and thinking that he knows more than his friends. And then Eliphaz further accuses Job, this time of thinking that he's pure, and so he says to him, "What are mortals that they can be clean? Or those born of a woman that they can be righteous? God puts no trust even in his holy ones, and the heavens are not clean in his sight. How much less one who is abominable and corrupt, one who drinks iniquity like water." And Eliphaz really gets into his speech as he's now like, "Oh, I will actually show you. Listen to me now as I declare what the sages have told and their ancestors have not hidden." And so he then starts to describe how the life of the wicked man looks like, and yeah, he's basically describing Job here. Because he says that the wicked man suffers torment every single day, day. He doesn't believe that he will ever escape from darkness, and on top of that, he stretches out his hand against God. And then Eliphaz really lets his imagination run wild as he begins to describe what later happens to the wicked men, and so he says, "They will live in desolate cities, in houses that no one should inhabit, houses destined to become heaps of ruins. They will not be rich, and their wealth will not endure, nor will they strike root in the earth. They will not escape from darkness, the flame will dry up their shoots, and their blossom will be swept away by the wind." And then at the end of his speech, we actually get some more direct accusations against Job, and so Eliphaz says, "They conceive mischief and bring forth evil, and their belly prepares deceit." And by they, he of course means both the wicked man and Job. And so after this very comforting speech from his dear friend, Job replies, calling them all his miserable comforters, and saying that if they were in his place, he could also say stuff against them and shake his head at them. But he would never actually do something like this. He would just encourage them, and his words would bring them relief. Now, after saying this, Job just laments that no matter what he does, everything is just bad, because if he speaks, then his pain is not relieved, but if he stays silent, then it doesn't go away. And he gets really into it as he says, "God gives me up to the evil and casts me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease and he broke me in two. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surround me. He slashes open my kidneys and shows no mercy. He pours out my gall on the ground." And he also laments here that all of this is happening even though his hands are free of violence and his prayer is pure. And then after that, Job just basically continues to lament, saying that his days are now over and that his only hope is Sheol, which is like a place for the dead. And also a very nice card in Magic the Gathering. Or I guess it's like Sheol the Dead. Like, it's so nice once you get it in the game and the opponent doesn't have any sort of like destroy spell or something like that. It's amazing. Then after Job stops lamenting, Bildad speaks again, and at first he just complains that Job thinks that his friends are stupid, and then he goes into this elaborate description of how bad the life of the wicked man is. And that's because it's completely dark, it's full of traps and terrors, and the wicked man's skin is consumed by disease. Which, again, he's basically describing Job here, as also remember that in the beginning we were told that Job now has some sort of disease. And on top of that, nothing remains in the wicked man's tent, and there are no survivors where he used to live. Which, once again, that's basically just Job. And then Bildad eventually ends saying that, well, such is the life of those who do not know God. To this, Job replies, and he of course complains here that his friends decided to just torment him, break him into pieces with their words, and make his humiliation an argument against him. And then Job once again laments that God made him suffer so incredibly much, and now everyone despises him, including his wife, his relatives, and his servants. But still, Job actually wishes here for his words to be written down somewhere, as he's sure that God will eventually bring him justice. Now, after Job says all of this, Zophar now speaks, and he's very agitated here, as he had to listen to a reproof that insulted him, and so he just has to answer. And he does, asking whether Job realizes that the joy of the godless is very short, and even though the pride of the wicked man makes his head reach the clouds, he will eventually perish forever. And then Zophar basically continues to describe the life of the wicked man, which of course just so happens to sound exactly what Job has been going through. And after Zophar ends, Job speaks once again, and he's basically just like, okay, can you please listen to me for at least a moment, and then after I finish you can go back to mocking me. And so he basically starts to talk here about the idea of the wicked man, because like, according to his friends, the wicked man suffers greatly in his life, but Job concludes here that, Well, actually, when you look at the wicked men, you realize that many of them don't actually suffer on earth. And so what Job's friends are saying is just basically not true when you actually look at how the world looks like. And so Job begins here by asking, how is it that the wicked go on living, they reach old age and only grow in power? How is it that their houses are safe, they spend their years in prosperity, and then they go down to Sheol in peace? And still, the wicked don't want to know God, and they don't want to follow his ways, simply because they don't see any profit in it. And so how is it that one dies in full prosperity, feeling secure and at peace, and the other one dies in the bitterness of his soul, never having enjoyed anything good? And yet they lie down alike in the dust, and the worms cover them both. And so Job then says that, well, considering all of this, his friends have to be wrong when they say that the wicked are always punished and the righteous are always rewarded. And he also adds, how then will you comfort me with empty nothings? There is nothing left of your answers but falsehood. And to this, Eliphaz answers, and he makes a couple of points here. The first one is that no mortal man is truly useful to God. The second one is that God is clearly not reproving Job for his piety. And the third one is that Job's sins are endless. And so Eliphaz begins to list Job's sins, which are stripping people of their clothing, not giving water to the weary, withholding food from the hungry, and sending widows empty-handed. Then Eliphaz once again tells Job to reconcile with God and be at peace with him, and he also further advises Job to treat gold like dust and the Almighty like gold. Following that, we get an answer from Job, who says that he really wishes he knew where to find God, because he would love to just lay out his case before him. But unfortunately, Job is not able to find the Lord, even though he has always followed him, which he describes in a fragment that reads, "My feet have closely followed his steps. I have kept to his way without turning aside. I have not departed from the commands of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my daily bread." And here, Job is just pretty much terrified of God because he sees him as this powerful being that does whatever he desires. And then after that, Job talks a bit about the wicked men, saying that they hurt the poor and needy, they rebel against the light, and they live in total darkness. To this, Bildad now answers, and he basically says here that God is great and that humans can't even be righteous before him, as they are all just some worms. Which is kind of irritating because I feel like Bildad didn't even care to listen to Job, and he's just basically saying whatever here. And yeah, Job thinks so as well, because he now says, "How you have helped the powerless, how you have saved the arm that is feeble, what advice you have offered to one without wisdom, and what great insight you have displayed." And then Job goes into this elaborate description of God's greatness, probably just to show that not only he was already aware of everything that Bildad told him, but he knows even more than that. Even though he kind of tries to stay humble, as at the end he also adds, "And these are but the outer fringe of his works. How faint the whisper we hear of him. Who then can understand the thunder of his power?" After that, Job continues to speak, and this time he says that as long as he's alive, he will never admit that his friends are right, and he will never let go of his righteousness. And now at this point, Job gets actually pretty irritated, as he says that he will teach them about the power of God and about the fate of those who are wicked. And so he explains that the fate of the children of the wicked man is the sword, and that he goes to bed with wealth but wakes up without it. And then Job also has some things to say about wisdom, and he says that the place of understanding is unknown to mortals and that it cannot be found in the land of the living. Furthermore, the primordial sea doesn't have it, it cannot be bought with gold nor exchanged for jewels, and its price is above pearls. And so wisdom is hidden from the eyes of the living, and even death only heard rumors of it, but you know who has access to wisdom? God. And so Job now says, God understands the way to it, and he knows its place, for he looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. And then Job ends this part of his speech by saying that God said to humans, Truly, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. Following all of that, Job recalls the good old days when God watched over him, when his children were still alive, and when everyone respected him greatly. And it turns out that during that time, he actually helped a lot of people, including the poor who cried out for help, the orphans who had no one, and the widow whose heart rejoiced only thanks to him. And so here we can see that according to what Job is saying, his friends were really mistaken in their judgment, especially after he says, I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I championed the cause of the stranger. I broke the fangs of the unrighteous and made them drop their prey from their teeth. And not only did he help the needy so much, but he also had a great authority among his people, as everyone listened to him and wanted his advice. But now everyone just mocks him, including those who are younger than him and those who are driven out from society. They all just simply detest him and do not hesitate to spit at the sight of him. And now, after saying all of this, Job once again laments about his current suffering, which he's just incapable of understanding. And then at the end of his very long speech, Job starts to list all the ways that indicate that he's innocent, as he says things like, if I lusted over another man's wife, then may my wife grind another man's grain, and may other men sleep with her. Interesting choice of words here. And then he's also like, if I denied justice to any of my servants, then what would I do when God confronts me? And if I have raised my hand against an orphan, then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder. And so in general, we learn here that before everything happened, Job was always feeding the orphans, providing what the poor desired, and he never rejoiced at the ruin of those who hated him. And so we can conclude here that Job was always a pretty nice guy, despite everything that his friends have been saying about him. Now, after Job's speech, his friends refuse to answer, but we see a new character entering the scene. It's Elihu, and he's very angry here. And that's because Job has been justifying himself, while God is the only one who should be allowed to do it. But interestingly, Elihu is also angry with Job's friends, as they couldn't find the right answer, even though they declared that Job is in the wrong. And it's also noted here that Elihu had actually waited to speak to Job just because he's the youngest guy in the group, and so he was a bit shy. But now, after everyone irritated him so much, he finally speaks, and he starts by saying that in the beginning he said to himself, "Let days speak and many years teach wisdom. But truly, it is the Spirit and immortal, the breath of the Almighty, that makes for understanding. It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right." And so he then tells everyone to listen to him. And in the beginning he makes a point that no one actually listened to what Job had to say, and no one truly answered him. And then Elihu goes on to say that he really needs to speak on this matter because he's so agitated that it's impossible for him to stay silent. And so at first he speaks to Job and tells him that, well, you said that you're pure, and yet God has punished you and considers you his enemy, but that doesn't really add up because that's just not really how God works. On top of that, Job declared that God is not answering him, but he didn't consider that God speaks to us in two ways. The first one is through a dream, where God terrifies people with warnings so that they may turn from wrongdoing and spare their souls from the pit. And the second one is through severe suffering that brings a person very close to death, only for an angel to appear and serve as a mediator who declares the person upright. And then the person prays to God, who then repays him for his righteousness. And after the person is restored from their suffering, they sing to others and say that they have sinned, but they did not get what they deserved, because God has redeemed their souls from going down to the pit, and now their life shall see the light. And so Elihu concludes here that God repeats this process a bunch of times just to make sure that he will bring back the souls of mortals from the pit so that they may come back to light. And so I guess it's kind of different than what Job's friends have been saying, because they were basically like, oh, you're suffering, and so that means that you're a nasty sinner and you have to repent and then everything is going to be good. But Elihu is more like, well, sometimes God makes us suffer just to purify our souls in some sort of way, and so it's not like a hard punishment for your sin, it's more like an opportunity for Job to be even better than he was before. The only problem is that, Elihu still believes that Job is kind of guilty in this situation in some sort of way, and we know that it's not the case, that he literally was blameless and upright, and God was just like, yeah, let's see what happens. So going back to the story, Elihu continues his speech and he encourages everyone to think about this issue together. And so Elihu recalls that Job declared that he's innocent, and yet God has taken away his right, that his wound is incurable even though he did not transgress. But that's just simply impossible, because it's just unimaginable that God would do something wrong and that he would pervert justice. And so Elihu now repeats the idea that God repays everyone for what they have done, he's definitely just, and his judgment is perfect as he sees every step of every human. And then he accuses Job of speaking without knowledge, answering like a wicked man, adding rebellion to his list of sin, and thinking that he's more righteous than God. And Elihu continues to talk because he really has a lot to say. And he basically just repeats that God does not allow the wicked to live, and that he gives justice to the oppressed. On top of that, he does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but if they are bound in chains and trapped in suffering, then he tells them what they have done and commands them to repent of their evil. And if they listen and serve him, then they will spend the rest of their lives in prosperity. But if they don't listen, then they shall perish by the sword and die without knowledge. After saying all of that, Elihu praises God, compares his voice to a thunder, and says that God does not hold back his lightning bolts when his voice is heard, and he's also able to control the weather and all that kind of cool stuff. And then he tells Job to consider God's wonders and to realize that God is beyond human comprehension and also beyond our reach. But then right after, God kind of proves otherwise, because it turns out that he's not that out of reach, as a storm suddenly comes and God answers Job out of a whirlwind, and the first thing he says is, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me." And so God now begins to question Job, asking him, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it?" And so yeah, God is really not that impressed with Job's attitude here, and so he continues asking him questions like, "Have you commanded the morning since your days have begun? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds so that a flood of waters may cover you? And do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you give the horse its strength, and does the hawk take flight by your wisdom?" And I think that it's interesting to point out that God in the book of Job is extremely connected to nature, and we can argue why that is. So let's argue. Okay, no. I mean like friendly argument. Because I think that if you're not a believer, then you can kind of see it as this like slow development of the idea of God in some sort of way. So like, when people just explain the things that they don't understand as just God doing his thing. And then on the other hand, if you were a believer, then I think that we could say that God is just kind of like adjusting the way he speaks to the level of understanding of the human he's talking to. But no matter what, I think that is just very interesting to point out that God in the book of Job is so extremely connected to nature. And I don't know why that is. I have no idea why that is. You can have so many explanations. I think that, in general, kind of like our minds work in this way that like if you want to believe something, you will always find a way of believing it. So yeah, I literally don't know why that is. I'm just pointing out something, I guess. And now you can think about this if you're interested. Now, to all of this, Job replies saying, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. And so to this, God tells Job to brace himself like a man, as he has some more questions for him, and Job shall answer. And God is then like, would you condemn me to justify yourself? Look on all who are proud and humble them, bring them low and hide them all in the dust. Only then I will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. And after that, God tells Job to look at some cool monsters that he made, like for example Behemoth, who's very strong with bones made of bronze and who ranks first among the works of God. Or for example Leviathan, who's so powerful that you can't possibly catch it or make a pet out of it. And in general, we learn a bit about Leviathan here, and it turns out that it has a double coat of armor, some fearsome teeth, flames that go out of its mouth, and also a heart that's hard as a rock. And it also has no equal on earth and is king over all who are proud. So now, after hearing how powerful God is, and also about both Leviathan and Behemoth, Job is definitely quite humbled, and so he admits that he spoke of things he did not understand, things that are too wonderful for him to know. And then Job ends his short speech to God by saying, you said, listen now and I will speak. I will question you and you shall answer me. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. And after that, God actually speaks to Eliphaz and tells him that he's very angry with him and his two friends because they have not spoken the truth about him as his servant Job has. Therefore Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar should take 7 bulls and 7 rams, go to Job, and then sacrifice burnt offerings for themselves. Then Job will pray for them, God will accept his prayer and won't deal with them according to their folly. And so the 3 friends then go and do exactly what the Lord told them to do. Job then prays, and the Lord of course accepts his prayer. Now when it comes to Job, we learn that God restored his fortunes right after he prayed for his friends, and he actually gave him twice as much as he had before. And then all of Job's sisters and brothers came to him along with the people who had known him before, and they all ate with him in his house. Which, that's not really nice, because like what, they suddenly remember about him now that he's rich again? And it's also said here that now they comfort him for all the wrongs that the Lord brought upon him, and they also give him a piece of silver and a gold ring, which kinda useless now. Like, couldn't they do that before, when he actually needed that? Job has some amazing friends, that's for sure. After that, we learned that God really blessed the second part of Job's life more than the first one, and that's because he later had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters, which is the same as before. And we also learn here that Job's daughters were of course the most beautiful women on earth, and he also gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. So very nice of him. And then after all of that, Job lived 140 years, so 4 generations of his offspring, and then died, old and full of years. And with that, we end the story. And so, that was the whole story of the book of Job. What do you think about it? Because I guess what strikes me the most is that it kind of seems like God didn't really care that much about Job's suffering, in a sense that, like, because I know that you can be like, oh, but he gave him so much in the end. I don't mean that, I mean like the emotional aspect, you know? It's almost like Job's suffering was kind of like insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and so it was just kind of, I don't know, I feel like the best comparison that I had in my head when I was reading the book of Job. And before I even say it, I know that it's a silly example, I know, But the thing that I was thinking about was kind of like when a human plays The Sims, you know, so like you play The Sims and you kind of care about them, you kind of want them to do good, but at the same time, you know, if like suffering happens or something, then you're kind of like detached emotionally. It really, like, reading the book of Job really felt like reading about a human playing The Sims. Or I guess maybe because I just play The Sims in this sort of way, you know, like I like to inflict suffering on my Sims, but just for growth, not just because, but because they need to like go through something, because then it's interesting. If everything is perfect, then it's kind of like, what's the point really? But when they suffer, yeah, this is nice. When they have to, for example, like live somewhere in the forest in a tent, amazing, and they don't have any money and they have to like just kind of figure it out. It's one of the best things you can do in The Sims. And so on one hand, I think that you can have this impression when you read the book of Job that God is kind of like cold and just detached emotionally, but I think that he's actually right. And let me explain why. But to do that, I first have to explain to you how I see death, I guess. And you know what? By the way, this is going to be like more of my personal interpretation, because sometimes I try to say things that make sense, and sometimes I just have some sort of interpretation that I like, and yeah. And this one is definitely just something that I like. This one is not really one of my most serious interpretations, but it's fun. It definitely is fun. So let me explain how I see death. I kind of see death as waking up. I think that it's very similar, like it's a very similar process in some sort of way. And so because of that, I kind of have this like hierarchy of what's real and significant, and I think that a dream is at the bottom of this hierarchy, and then this human reality that we live right now is in the middle. And then the afterlife is what's actually real and significant. And so I think that basically, you know, when you look at suffering, for example, think about your suffering in a dream. When you suffer in a dream and then you wake up, you kind of think that your suffering was not real in some sort of way, because a dream is not real. Even though you did suffer, you know, like you still suffered, you still felt the suffering, you experienced suffering in your dream. But just because you wake up, you think that just because a dream is not real, your suffering was also not really real, even though it was because you experienced it. And so in my opinion, the same happens with your suffering that you experience in your human life. So you know, when you suffer right now in your human life, you of course think that it's real, just as when you're in a dream, you also think that your suffering in a dream is real. But then, you know, after you wake up, you realize that it wasn't. And I think that after you die, you also experience something similar. But it doesn't mean that your suffering is not significant at all. It just means that there's something higher than that, you know? And so, you know, going back to Job, when you consider this earthly life, this human life, as the highest possible reality, then of course what happened to Job seems completely horrible, and God seems to be very cold and just like detached emotionally, and yeah, the story is not really that nice when you consider the human life as the highest possible reality, basically. But I think, and again, is this biblical? No. Is this scientific? No. Is this anything like, no, just me thinking, okay? I'm just thinking here that literally just that. But I think that God kind of sees our earthly life just as we see our dreams in some sort of way. Something that of course feels very real when you're in it, but once you leave it, you suddenly realize that it was not as real and significant, but just because there's something bigger than that. There's something that's even more real and significant. So like, it doesn't mean that your human life is not important and not real. No, it just means that there's something even more real and significant than that. I don't know, like, I don't know. I literally don't know. Don't treat it seriously. Do not treat it seriously. I'm literally just having fun here. So basically, when I was thinking about this, it just makes the most sense to me that like, just as when you're in a dream and you really believe that your dream is real, but then you wake up and you realize that, you know, oh, this is the actual reality. I think that something similar happens when you die. You die and you suddenly realize that the afterlife is the actual reality, and the human life was kind of real, kind of not. kind of complicated, I guess. And so I guess, you know, considering all of that, I think that what's really important in your life is the state of your heart. And if anything is important in this earthly life, it's probably the state of your heart. Because basically, once you die, everything that happened on earth will seem like a dream, but the state of your heart is going to stay with you. And so, did I answer the question of why suffering in the book of Job? Well, no, because I think that there are just things that are far more important than that, like the state of your heart. And so I guess what I'm really getting at with all of this is that, you know, you can spend your whole life avoiding suffering if you concentrate on suffering too much. And in the meantime, you can let your heart become very, very nasty. And so yeah, at least to me, paying attention to the state of your heart is so much more important. And if suffering comes along the way, then so be it. Then again, those are my conclusions, you know, because like sometimes when I talk about some sort of like conclusions or opinions on the channel, then I'm actually like citing the Bible or something, then I guess it's more real. But sometimes I just kind of talk. And this is definitely just me talking and having fun with the ideas. So, you know, don't take it too seriously, because I probably don't even take it seriously in some sort of way. I don't know how to explain it, because like I really do believe it, because I don't have anything better to believe, I guess. But at the same time, if someone would like point me to another direction, then I'm probably going to just start believing something else. Those are not some sort of like hard beliefs that I have. It makes the most sense in my head, but at the same time, I just couldn't find a better alternative of thinking, I think. Yeah, I think that this is it. Because like I also have this thing that like, you know, I really like to search for alternatives. I don't really like to search for problems. I always like to search for alternatives and not problems. Because if you search for problems in something, then you will find problems everywhere. Like everywhere. Just everywhere. And so I don't really like to do that, because that just makes you very miserable, I think. And so, yeah, I don't know. When I think about stuff like this, I always try to find like the best alternative possible, and if I'm not able to find a better explanation, then I just kind of stop with my views until I learn something new or something like that. I don't know. I want you to form your own opinions. That's very important to me, that you form your own opinions, that you hear me and maybe you're like, oh, that makes sense, let me like research that. Or maybe you hear me and you're like, oh, this is so stupid, let me think something else. Yeah, that's basically that. But yeah, other than that, the Book of Job is such a nice story. I can definitely relate to it, which I don't know. Can I overshare on the internet? Yeah, let me overshare a bit. I mean, like, this is probably the end of the video. That's definitely the end of the video, so I can overshare a bit. Unless you just clicked on a timestamp and didn't actually watch the video. In that case, you're not allowed to watch this. You have to watch the video first. Me oversharing is for people who watch the whole video. Other than that, I don't know, I feel like I relate to the story of Job so much when it comes to this whole, like, you know, you lose everything just like instantly. I definitely went through that, and so it was so interesting to read this story. Because I definitely can see myself in it. And you know, not to overshare too much, because like I don't want the details to be out on the internet, but I can tell you that like a couple of years ago I had this situation where basically, well, imagine that 1 month I had so much going on. I had a nice job that was kind of like, I don't know how you say it, like a job that would give you a lot of money in the future, kind of like a career stuff or something like that going on. And I was also studying my dream thing at university, which was not even Polish, because like I have a degree in Polish, but then I went and I studied something else. And so I was studying my dream thing at university. And I was also in a relationship, and I actually lived with my partner. And so from the outside, everything was great, you know, like everything was just amazing. A nice job that could lead me to some sort of career, my dream thing at university, being in a relationship, living with your partner, just like I had everything together. And then literally next month, everything lost. I didn't have anything anymore. So crazy to even like recall this time of my life, but it did happen basically. And the downfall of all of those things was kind of like related, but kind of not. But yeah, basically 1 month I had a job, I was studying my dream thing, and I was in a relationship. Next month I quit my job, my relationship ended, and university also kind of ended. Kind of because like, I don't know, I took a break from university, but then I just never came back to the thing that I was studying, so yeah, so it kind of ended at that time as well. So fun times. That was fun. That was definitely one of the most intense months of my life. Oh, and I also moved cities right after that. That was actually crazy. Now that I think of it, that was crazy stuff. But I survived. So yeah, so when I was reading the book of Job, I really related to him. Because like literally, and it's so weird, because like that's the weirdest thing I think. When Job is just like sitting on the ground and he just doesn't know what to do with himself. I think that it is like this. Because like I can tell you that when everything just kind of fell apart in my life, I also didn't know what to do with myself, because you just don't know what to do with yourself, like literally, because when you have a job and you're studying at university and you are in a relationship, your life is going to kind of like revolve around those things, because you don't really have much time for anything else. And so when everything ends in a month, it's crazy, because you don't know what to do with yourself, you know? Like you wake up and you're like, what and like literally what am I supposed to do with my day? So that was crazy. But yeah, at the end of the day, I can tell you that my story is also kind of similar to Job, maybe not exactly, because like, yeah, definitely not exactly, but I'm so happy that my life fell apart during that time. Like I am so extremely happy, you have no idea. I was so unhappy in that life. That was one of the cases that, you know how sometimes you see a person and from the outside their life just is so amazing, but the person is not happy. So yeah, I was a person like this, definitely not happy in my life. And so yeah, I think that this is also interesting, because like I can tell you that during that time I really did suffer. But at the same time, now that I look back, I literally see this suffering as blessing, because if that life didn't end, I would be so extremely unhappy. Like so extremely unhappy. You cannot even imagine that. I cannot even imagine that. So yeah, suffering is kind of weird, because like of course you don't want to go through it, and of course once you're in it you want to leave the suffering, but then, you know, when you look at the whole picture, sometimes you notice that it was actually good for you. And I'm not saying that is the case for everyone, of course not. I was just lucky, I guess, and Job was also lucky. But sometimes it is like this. Sometimes you suffer and then you're better off after you endure this period of suffering. That's a little bit of me oversharing on the internet, I guess. But yeah, I felt like I have to talk about this, because like my situation from my life is just so similar to what Job has been going through. And when I was reading the book of Job, I was just constantly thinking about my own situation from a couple of years ago. So I don't know, I thought that I just have to include it basically. And yeah, I guess, I don't know, if you're going through something similar, I'm really rooting for you, because like it's not easy to be in a state like this. It definitely is not. I guess like the thing that really helped me a lot, which I don't want to make this video into some sort of like, oh, I'm going to tell you how to be happy. I don't know that. I don't know how to be happy. Or like I try, but like, you know, do I really know? I don't know. Yeah, considering all of that, I can tell you that like what got me through that point was just like taking basically living day by day in some sort of way, you know, just like paying attention to what can I do with my day, like not think too far ahead, not to go back to the memories, just like concentrate on the day that I'm living in and just like try to make the best out of it basically. And I think that it really works when you're in this suffering that Job has been going through, when you kind of like lose so much or something like that and you just really suffer. I think that taking like day by day is really good, because like you just concentrate on what you can do right now, and usually those are kind of like smaller things that you can do that really help you. And then eventually, I think that eventually you kind of like come out of it, you know, somewhere. I don't know where, but like you come out somewhere. And I definitely experienced that as well. I was just kind of concentrating on my day, and eventually my life started to kind of like clear up again, and now I can like confidently look into the future and everything like that. I don't know, like as I'm saying, I am definitely not some sort of psychiatrist or something, so like I'm just a person talking to you. So yeah, now that I overshared and I also, I don't know, gave you some sort of tips or something, I guess this is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, especially that you're watching till the end. You can subscribe to the channel, that's going to be very, very nice, and bye bye.